Hey Alexa, write my essay.
How easy is it to produce a research essay? What about an accurate one? How worthwhile are these tools for the writing and research process? In this video, I'm going to put Microsoft's new Bing AI to the test on a source-based essay for a history class. I'm a writing teacher. I've taught writing and humanities at the college level for 15 years. But I'm also a writer. And I'm tremendously excited by the potential of these tools to help writers, teachers, and students write better and more efficiently, and most important, learn in the process. For this demonstration, I decided to do some research on Britain's role in the Crimean War. I've always been a little captivated by Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, and now I'm working on a story set in Britain during the American Civil War. One of my characters lost his father in the Crimean War, and his mother's perspective on how his father died and why influences their current perspective on whether or not Britain should intervene in the American War. But I don't know much more about the Crimean War than Tennyson's poem and Florence Nightingale, the famous nurse. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to show you how a professional writer might use these tools for basic research and brainstorming, and how a student might use them in similar ways to produce an essay, in this case, for a history class. Now, I'm not going to dive into questions of cheating, plagiarism, and authorship in this video. Here, I want to show what the tools can do, and especially how a writer can use them productively. The ethics of it is something, I think, for discussion. I'm going to assume for our purposes here that my student self was not given a very specific prompt for a history paper, but instead was told to choose a topic relating to the course material. I guess this would be a world history class of some kind, and I've probably been told to pick a particular focus that I'm interested in. So as I said, I decided to write on Britain's role in the Crimean War. That's still pretty broad, as my teacher would probably tell me, but we have to start somewhere, and that narrows down my initial research to a manageable question. What was Britain's role in the Crimean War? This is what I want to learn more about. Specifically, why did Britain engage in the war, and why was it romanticized the way it was, and how did the British public feel about it afterward? I especially want to know how people were feeling in the decade following the war, because I imagine this would influence how they felt about Britain getting involved in another devastating war. So I'm going to call on my AI buddies to help me out. The new Bing search engine makes searching for basic information and sources a lot less frustrating than it used to be, because instead of combing through pages and pages of links, you can use the chat feature to ask it for exactly what you want to know. Bing will try to find some good sources for you and package them up in a nice, easy-to-digest overview. You can then explore the linked sources it suggests. Here, I've asked first for some authoritative sources on my topic, so I'll have these on hand. This Spartacus Educational looks kind of interesting because it has a variety of what Bing tells me are primary and secondary sources. And remember, my assignment calls for both of these. I also know that the National Archives and War Office's original records are going to be primary sources, and I might find some really interesting records there that will put me right in the time period. All I have to do is click on the link and go from there. Bing also invites me to narrow down my focus so it can help me find even more targeted sources. It's kind of fun to just play the little kid and ask it every how and why question I can think of. Unlike a busy parent or teacher, Bing never gets tired of answering. My question about British public opinion actually yields some really interesting results that could be useful for both an academic essay and my creative story. An article from an online academic journal that directly addresses my question and, interestingly, also takes a novelist perspective. And a master's thesis that seems to argue that public opinion played a greater role in Britain's involvement in the war than is generally acknowledged. These sources could introduce some fresh and interesting ideas that might be worth debating in my essay. Before I fall too far down the research rabbit hole, I want to generate some basic background material that I can quickly digest, and that will make it easier for me to understand the more detailed scholarly articles. Bing can give me this too if I ask it to write me an essay or other kind of article. Remember, the new Bing uses the same technology as ChatGPT, but with the next generation language model, so it's a great place to start if you don't want to pay any subscription fees, and you just want to take the shortest path to your goal, in this case an essay. Most instructors provide some kind of prompt on an assignment sheet that provides instructions and requirements for the essay. If the prompt is clear and specific, you can try copying and pasting it straight into the prompt field. But there's no guarantee that an assignment prompt has come packaged in a tidy sentence or two, with all the specifics a generative AI tool needs to work well. So it's best you know how to tailor a prompt for yourself. And this is a great place for instructors to start when working with students on using generative AI. The key to a good prompt is the key to any good writing: specificity. Be as specific as you can be in telling the AI what you want it to do. And that begins with choosing the right verb. Remember, the verb is the to do, the action you want it to take. Just like the verb in an exam prompt tells us what to do in our written response: describe or summarize, analyze or evaluate. The verb we use in our prompt tells the AI what kind of response we're looking for: a summary, a description, an analysis, or even an argument. If I ask the AI to explain Britain's involvement in the Crimean War, I'll get a very broad overview of the causes and effects, the main reasons Britain got involved in the war, and the effects of their involvement, not to mention the basic context of the war, how it started, who it involved, and so on. That's some pretty good background information, like reading a textbook or encyclopedia passage explaining Britain's role in the war. That is, assuming the information is accurate. More on that shortly. But that isn't what the assignment is asking for. The assignment calls for an argument, which means we need to ask the AI to argue a specific, debatable claim about Britain's role in the war. Remember that I chose that topic, Britain's role in the war. I'd also used the chat feature in Bing to narrow down my topic more into the role of the British public and press. A great prompt is like a great thesis for an essay. The more narrow and specific it is, the better. That gives you plenty of room for more interesting and lesser-known details, and those are the details that make an argument compelling and an essay more interesting. You can see Bing does a pretty good job of cranking out what looks to my student self like a nicely detailed, clearly written essay on my topic. Not bad for a few minutes' work. And this is what most teachers are concerned about, that students will find it far too tempting to do this. The essay might look really good at first. It's over 1,000 words long, putting us close to our assignment goal, and it's clearly written, coherent, and focused on my topic. But it wouldn't do for the final assignment, not as it is. Besides not being long enough, it doesn't cite any sources for its information. Remember, the assignment called specifically for primary and secondary sources, and all sources of information need to be clearly cited in an essay, not just on a works cited or references page, but also in the body of the essay itself to let your reader know where you've gotten your facts and ideas. This is one of the trickiest parts of developing a research academic essay, clearly citing sources in the body of the essay, called in-text citation, using the appropriate format for the discipline. In this case, MLA, or Modern Language Association format. And how could you adequately go back and insert research sources into a completed essay? Well, AI can help you do that too, as I'll show you in a few minutes. But first, you should know that Bing actually did not finish the essay on the first pass. I just made it look like it did, thanks to the magic of video editing. But sometimes an AI tool will just cut off its response in the middle if the response is very long. It's like it runs out of steam, or words. That's what Bing did. A neat feature of Bing's AI is that you can page back through your earlier responses. Here is my original prompt, and you can see where the response began to degrade toward the end, inserting all these weird paragraph breaks, and then just cutting off abruptly in the middle of the sentence. But all I had to do to get it to finish the essay was simply tell it to with a new prompt. I gave it the instruction to finish the essay, picking up from this final passage of text I copied into my prompt. Because Bing is fairly limited in how much text you can ask it to process at one time, I could only give it the last paragraph of its original response, and then hope that it knew it was near the conclusion and to just finish the essay. And it did. So all I had to do was just copy and paste this final response into the end of the essay. And voila, a complete essay in only 2 prompts in a few minutes. But again, the sources aren't cited, and that's liable to net me a failing grade if I turn it in like this. And that is assuming that the information it's given me is accurate and not riddled with AI hallucinations. That is another excellent reason to cite your sources, so you can make sure that what you're producing is actually true. Now remember, as with any of these generative AI tools, there is no guarantee that what it comes up with will be factually correct. So before I get invested in understanding or building on anything the AI has given me, I need to fact check it. Or have the AI fact check it. You can and should fact check anything you get AI to produce. To do this, I just start a conversation with Bing that explicitly asks it to fact check a piece of writing for me. When it signals it understands, I paste in the essay I want to fact check. Here, I'm going to paste in an essay I produced with ChatGPT on a similar prompt, just so I can compare it with what Bing produced. I want to fact check both essays just out of curiosity. Call it a friendly competition for the grade. The problem here is that we're limited with the amount of text we can ask it to check, so we have to break it up and feed it the essay in parts. It does a pretty good job of identifying what's presented as fact in the writing and searching for sources to confirm or challenge the information. It finds sources that back up all the factual information in the ChatGPT essay so far, and even gives me a few kudos for doing such a great job. Of course, those kudos belong to ChatGPT and not me. But the good news is that, as I paste in the rest of the essay, Bing tells me that ChatGPT seems to have gotten the information right for this essay, even if what it gave me was a fairly shallow, general overview of my topic. The ChatGPT essay was pretty short, so for test purposes, I'm going to feed it another, longer essay on the same topic, one that has more detail and still more potential for some factual errors or hallucinations. All I have to do is let it know that I have another piece of writing for it to fact check. Again, I have to break it up into smaller chunks, or it will only fact check the first few paragraphs, and that could be disastrous. What I find most impressive is Bing's ability to detect shades of gray in the information, so it doesn't just say something is correct or incorrect. It can also let me know when I've left out something important that might change the interpretation of the facts, and when I've made some assumptions and generalizations, as it says, that are not fully supported by the evidence. It also gives me some pretty good advice to detail the causal mechanisms in order to support my claim that Britain's strategy led to its success. That's something a lot of inexperienced writers overlook when trying to make an argument about causes and effects. But it's something my teacher would doubtless expect of a well-supported argument. As you can see, the feedback on the lengthier draft is more detailed and detects more errors, omissions, and debatable claims that would need arguing in the essay. But this gives me plenty to go on as I begin to read my research sources with my background knowledge on the war fresh in my mind, and it gives me a good number of additional primary and secondary sources to follow up on. Best of all, I can keep working on formulating and revising my argument while I get feedback from the AI every step of the way. It's like having a teaching assistant in my pocket. Actually, it's like having a teaching assistant and a librarian in my pocket, working together to give me the feedback I need. And while having a live teacher and a librarian would be ideal, they aren't always available when I have the time to get my work done. Like 3 a.m. on a Sunday. So let's see what it says about the accuracy of its own essay. Again, I have to copy it in piece by piece because it can't process the entire essay at once. But if you're using Microsoft Word online through Microsoft 365, you can do this more efficiently if you stay in Word. All you have to do is highlight the text you want to check, and Bing asks you if you want to send it to the chat. Click Send and then tell it what you want it to do with the text. In this case, fact check. Exploring Bing's evaluation and the sources it offers up for all of the questionable information is a great research activity. But what if I don't have enough time to build my knowledge of my topic, step by step like this? Bing can, of course, write me an essay that already includes cited sources, making the job of producing the sourced essay a lot faster and easier. In fact, Bing isn't the only tool that can do this, but all the large language models behind the generative AI tools are going to suffer to some extent from the tendency to invent facts and sources that don't exist. What I want to do is test how big the problem is and see if there's any way around it. Let's have Bing write a research essay this time. To get a clear direction, I'm going to tell it to argue the claim, or thesis, that's stated in its original draft essay on the topic, but I'm going to tell it to cite sources this time in MLA format. When it finishes generating, I'll hit the copy button and paste the text into a new Microsoft Word document. It's producing quite a bit of text. It will be interesting to see how much the incorporation of source material has changed the content of the essay. And as a teacher, one thing I especially want to see is an effective use of the source material. Brief quotations that are given context and not just dropped in by themselves, and big use of paraphrase and summary that avoid inadvertent plagiarism and misrepresentation. Now, as with the last essay it generated, Bing stopped before it finished the essay. So just like I did before, I'm going to copy the last part of what it generated and then go back to the compose field and tell it to write the rest of an essay that follows this text. Maybe I should have left in, that argues the claim I'm arguing, but doesn't look like it matters. It looks like it repeats the text I copied in and then continues with the rest of the essay. Nice. So when it's done, I just copy that text and paste it into the end of my document. I need to be sure to paste it over the passage I copy, so I don't have it repeated in my essay. It looks like it still hasn't finished the essay, so I'm going to repeat the process one more time. And because I see it's already given me 4 main points for my essay, and I already have over 1,300 words, I'm going to tell it more specifically in the prompt to write the end of the essay. The only reason I didn't use the word conclude or conclusion was that I was afraid it would just give me a concluding paragraph and leave that previous paragraph unfinished. Again, it repeats my copied passage, and then it continues, and it does conclude the essay. It even gives me the works cited page. Outstanding. Of course, I want to make sure that it hasn't cut that page off, but it's unlikely it has, since works cited entries are always alphabetized, and the third entry here begins with W. It's unlikely there are any entries after W that it cut off. It doesn't hurt to double check though, and you can do that by going back to the chat and repeating the process we used to fact check the text. Just copy a passage of a paragraph or so, but this time ask it to identify the sources in the passage. You can even ask it to give you the sources in MLA format. It finds the source that already has an entry on the works cited page. But of course, if it's overlooking a source, the only way to catch that is to read the paragraph for ourselves and look for any potential references to sources that aren't already on that works cited page. And this is how I discovered that Bing has indeed overlooked some sources that it cites in text. For example, here's a quote with a parenthetical citation that says, quoted in Lambert, but there is no Lambert listed as a source in the works cited. There needs to be because the essay has literally cited Lambert as a source right here. Who is this Lambert? I try various ways of asking Bing for more information about this source, but it's unable to give me any. It seems to have completely missed the fact that it was the one that came up with the source. But it's a mystery source. Is it invented? So we're clearly stuck in Bing's own echo chamber, and the best approach at this point is to leave it, to cross-check this source outside of Bing. This is just like cross-checking information we get from source using other sources. I teach my students that it's important to evaluate claims and evidence by checking them in a variety of independent sources. If you stick to just one source, you're limited to the biases and other limitations of that one source. Similarly, if you stick to just one AI tool, you can still end up with invented or, at best, poorly cited information, no matter what you actually tell the AI to do. And it's worth pointing out here that the sources Bing gave us for this research essay were all secondary sources. There were no primary sources. All the newspaper quotes from the Crimean War were quoted in other sources, like books written more recently. While these books may be perfectly credible, they are secondary sources, and our assignment explicitly called for some primary sources as well. Not only that, but for a researched history essay at this level, 3 sources probably won't be enough. Depending on the class, 3 might meet a minimal requirement, but I know if it were my class, I'd want to see more than just 3 sources for an essay exploring this kind of historical question. And I would also definitely want to see some analysis of primary sources. In other words, I want to see what students think after reading newspaper articles at the time. I'm much less interested in seeing them repeat other people's analyses, though that can be helpful for background. But for now, I want to track down that missing source. There really wasn't enough information here to track down the source without something more to go on. Now, it's tempting to ask Google's Bard, which uses its own Lambda language model. The problem is, Bard is about as inventive as they come. You have to take everything it gives you with a very large grain of salt. As you can see, it gave me a source, but I found Bard is almost never entirely accurate with these. Still, this is a lead, a full name I can now plug into a search engine to see if this author exists. And it turns out that Andrew Lambert is real, and he did write about the Crimean War. But his book, according to Amazon, is called The Crimean War, British Grand Strategy Against Russia. There is a book titled The Crimean War, A History, but it's by another author, Orlando Figes. This one keeps popping up in my background research, so it seems like one I ought to read. The lesson to take from this is that you really can't rely on any of the sources an AI generator drops into a piece of writing. At best, they can give you some leads to follow. That doesn't mean that the quotes and citations AI includes in an essay aren't without value. I think they can be very valuable in showing a writer how to incorporate source material effectively, and even what kinds of quotations and summaries are appropriate and effective. But we absolutely do not want to use any of the sources it gives us in an essay, at least not without checking, double-checking, and triple-checking those sources. Whatever checking you can do, you should do, and then do it some more. There are really no downsides to this, except the time it can take. But it is time that's absolutely well spent, if you really want to know the facts. The last thing we need is everyone on the planet blithely using invented facts in all their writing. But as I said, that doesn't mean these tools don't hold some pretty big benefits. I think the key to producing accurate source-based text is to work bit by bit. I found that starting with an outline in Bing instead of a complete essay and moving paragraph by paragraph using both the chat and compose features in Bing produces better, more accurate source-based content than any other method I've tried so far. An outline can be generated in any of these tools. You just have to specify in the prompt that you want an outline rather than an essay. Here, I just started with a draft thesis I got from an earlier AI draft, a claim about the influence of the British press on the outcome of the Crimean War. I copied it into a new Microsoft Word online document. And in the compose field in Bing, I prompted it for an outline for a 1,500-word essay that argues that claim. Here's the outline, which I copied into the document. I really like these outlines because they do a good job of suggesting not only a high-level organization for a convincing argument, but also what kinds of evidence and sources would be appropriate to develop each point. In other words, I find this to be a good stand-in when a student doesn't have a teacher or librarian available. For instance, Bing offers an appropriate way to structure the introduction by first giving some background, then transitioning to the particular focus the essay will take about the role of the British press, and then finally narrowing to the specific thesis, which we tell students should typically appear at the end of an introduction only after the context of the writing has been established. So this is good advice a student can follow to craft the introduction. For the first body paragraph, Bing suggests giving an analysis of how the British press portrayed the war as a noble and heroic crusade. That makes sense. So I want to get Bing to help me develop this main point into a paragraph or more using sources. I'm just going to highlight the text and send it to the chat, where I ask Bing to find me some sources to develop this point. I want to go back and add in Crimean War because I don't think it has that context in the chat. Remember, it's good practice to be as specific as you can, rather than make assumptions about what the AI knows. The same is true when dealing with people. It gave me some suggested sources in the response, even though I left that out of the revised prompt. But they seem to be all secondary sources, and I want to do as it suggested and include some quotes from some actual newspaper articles and cartoons from the time. Of course, Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, is a primary source, but that source doesn't directly support a point about what the press was saying. It was influenced by the reporting, but for this paragraph, I want some examples of the actual reporting. So I just asked for some primary sources in the chat. And unlike Bard, Bing does come up with some linked sources, so I can actually go to them and check that they're real and hopefully see what they say. This link to Spartacus Educational brings me to some excerpts from newspapers of the time. Those would be useful in a pinch if I can't find entire articles or just the right ones. Now, I could theoretically copy this text it gave me in the chat and paste it into the essay, but as you can see, it doesn't flow very well, and it doesn't even really analyze what the British press said at all. It's just some basic background. So, while the chat can give me some good suggestions for sources to use, I would need to go to Compose if I wanted to actually compose a paragraph on that point. But once it does, I can send the paragraph it generated back to the chat and ask it to fact check it. Though remember, we're in Bing's echo chamber, so there's no guarantee it will get this right. But the benefit of Bing is, as I said, that it will at least offer some real and linked sources to back up its own claims, sources we can and should check for ourselves. I'm not sure what it did there. It seemed to just rewrite what it said before. So I'm asking it to please confirm that the information is correct. It really is like talking to a small child sometimes. You have to be patient, but that's true of any research task. Just reading the text it generated for this main point, though, I see some obvious spots where examples can be inserted, such as quotations I can include from newspaper articles that illustrate this point, that newspaper articles and editorials at the time emphasized the need to defend British interests and honor. I just need to find an editorial or other opinion piece from a newspaper at the time that argues for a need to defend British interests. So again, I just highlight the statement that I want to support and ask it in the chat to find me examples. And now I finally have some access to some primary sources that directly address my topic. Again, this is where I can get lost in my own curiosity. There are few things I love to do more than read old newspapers and see what people were thinking and saying long ago. People are remarkably consistent, no matter how many decades and even centuries separate us. I find that despite some language barriers, I can relate to these people a lot more than I might have thought. And AI is a wonderful tool for helping cross those language barriers, something I'll show you in a later video. For now, it's important to note that you may not be able to access everything Bing finds. For instance, the British Newspaper Archive, like a lot of archives, is subscription-based, and I don't have a subscription. But this is where your school or public librarian can help. College students have access to a lot of sources that the general public would have to pay to access. For students, those subscriptions are covered in tuition. It's so important to take advantage of these sources while you can. With the time AI can save you planning for your essay and gathering basic background research, you can spend more time reading and synthesizing the best sources on your subject to come up with an interesting, well-thought-out argument that's uniquely your own. And voila! After going section by section and incorporating sources, I have an essay of just over 1,500 words with information I've checked for accuracy, and it only took me a couple of hours, factoring in the time I spent reading primary source material. That's less time than it took to produce this video. That means I have some time to spare, so I can go back and read those books and learn even more.